That's always a good question to start with, because I find that North American students, public at large, doesn't have much sense of what the Middle East is or is about. And I use the term what rather than where is the Middle East, because why there might be a sense of where it is, what it comprises varies from individual to individual. So I wanted to talk today, before going on to the question of the Arab-Israeli conflict, about what my concept of the Middle East is, and related largely to the geography. We have a map to show you about the Middle East. Is it the middle of the world? Middle East is actually a CIA term, introduced to replace what the British called the Near East. And the Near East had more of a sense of being the Near East of the Far East. The Middle East has come about, and all of the languages of the region now use it to refer to themselves as that invented place where we all have a piece of an understanding of homelands and neighborhoods. And I think we must understand that it's not only contested, but is also constructed. And what is the Middle East has to do with extraordinary geography and extraordinary diversity in religion and ethnicities, as a sacred site for where three monotheistic religions, that's Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, all got their start, has at its center a city called Jerusalem. It used to be known as the navel of the world, that is, navel of the world in sacred circles. It is a highly imaginary space in which we have imposed, oftentimes, our sense of what it should be about. So I would say, if you ask me what is the Middle East, you can see here an image of the contemporary Middle East in its political terms, but you also have, I have a map showing the topography of the Middle East, which is characterized by excessive sets of mountains, all kinds of deserts. It is a region that has evoked all kinds of things like Arabian Nights, like the story and tales of the Bible, the Torah, and the Quran. And we must always imagine it, even in the present day, and even about the Arab-Israeli conflict, is something that we turn and embrace as our own sort of understanding what the Middle East is. The three major languages, the fourth being Hebrew, of course, the three major languages are Turkish, Arabic, and Persian. If you were to describe the Middle East as defined by Turkish speakers, you would have to include all of Central Asia, all the way almost to Mongolia. Actually, Turkish originally came from Mongolia. If you would describe the Middle East as Arab, you have to take in all of North Africa. In fact, the Europeans are now calling it the Middle East and North Africa. If you haven't noticed, it's MENA, they refer to it. If you assume Iran and Persian as the third major languages of the three languages, you have to then extend it all the way through India and the Persian-speaking civilizations of the world. So the Middle East has all of these sort of threads that extend out of the region into all those civilizations. And that makes it very difficult to actually pin down what we describe as the Middle East. When I teach it, I talk about Turkey, Iran, and Egypt as the triangle. And in the middle of that triangle, of course, is Palestine. So think of the Middle East as great crossroads, sacred territories, and imperial battlegrounds. Two things need to be said about the Middle East that I described for you. The first is that Palestine is the size of a postage stamp. That we're speaking about a territory not much greater than Los Angeles, the territories of greater Los Angeles. The second thing that has to be said, every part of the Middle East as we presently understand it was once part of an empire called the Ottoman Empire until 1918. And that imperial past is one that we tend to ignore at our risk. The entire 19th century was about the struggle of peoples to break away from empires. That was true not just in the Middle East, break away from the Ottomans, but also about Russia, also about Austria and Germany. And as you know, in World War I, all of those empires collapse in the successor states, as Stephen Heathorn has described in his podcast on World War I quite ably. I will not duplicate it. In the Middle East, however, we have neglected to look at the impact of World War I on both the populations and the political outgrowth of the settlements of World War I. The Ottomans understood empire as a series of negotiations with multi-ethnic, multi-racial peoples. And so the notion of nation states was to contest imperial kind of sovereignty or suzerainty over a diverse set of peoples that extended from Austria, from Vienna. You come all the way around, the map shows it, all the way around to Algeria. The influence of the Ottomans extended, and down through parts of Saudi Arabia. Of course, the sultans were nominally in charge of Mecca and Medina before 1918. So there is this historical past that hangs heavily over the modern Middle East. At last count, some 27 countries emerge from what we call the Imperial Ottoman Empire. In 1918, the Ottomans had made the mistake at the time of siding with the Germans in World War I against, of course, the British and French and initially the Russians, and then found themselves having to surrender to the imperial powers in 1918. This capped a full century of struggle over what to do with the sick man of Europe as the Ottoman Empire was closed. It can also be viewed as the closing of the frontiers, the final frontier of Europe, as Eastern Europe was realigned and reassigned to various places in the late 19th century. And in the 20th century, you find the construction of a whole new set of nations, as Heathorn told us, out of the map of the Middle East. It was a series of decisions made by the British and French in World War I that produced the present-day map of the Middle East, drawing borders, as they did in Africa, that took little account of the peoples that lived in the territories or who might want to be with whom. So you have things like Iraq, which was made up of 3 territories of the Ottoman Empire. The border was simply drawn to sort of replace that without thinking about what an Iraqi might be. So too of the French, who took over Lebanon and Syria in the Mandate period. And that extended from 1918 into the 40s. And there's a trajectory we have to think about of the post-World War I Middle East that concerns a colonial, what you might think of as a colonial period. And it is in that context that Zionism and Israel was born. As I've suggested, the British and the French redrew the Middle East map to suit their imperial ambitions. The French in Lebanon and Syria, where there were connections to France, long connections to France, and the British insisted on keeping Palestine, which the mandate over Palestine is the one I will concentrate a little bit on now. And that was from 1918 to 1948. The important thing to remember is the conflicting agendas that are going on. The Wilsonian view of the post-World War I war, that is President Wilson's view in the League of Nations, was that these people deserve self-determination. And so in the League of Nations and in the international community, there was a lot of discussion about what to do with Kurds or Armenians or Turks or Arabs. But in fact, what ended up by 1920 is the imposition of these mandates. And what that meant for Palestine, which had already started to receive floods of Jews from Europe at the turn of the century, but between the wars, and particularly during and after World War II, you get this stream of persecuted Jews coming out of largely Eastern Europe, where the pogroms were underway, and then, of course, where Hitler started to exterminate the Jews. You find the increase of a Jewish homeland. Now, the British had said in 1917 in the Balfour Declaration that we recognize the need for a Jewish homeland. This is extended to Zionism, as it's called. Sort of Jewish nationalism accelerates after World War I and turns around the demography of Palestine, where you had an Ottoman population of Arabs who really began to see themselves as Palestinians in this contest over land, as I said, the postage stamp in Israel. So after World War II, this is particularly accelerated with the Holocaust in Germany and this huge flood, the migration out of Europe and into other parts of the world as well. But Jews under Zionist influence, nationalist Judaism I call it, saw Israel as the place to go. So it became a contest that the British had to oversee, and by the end of World War II they were absolutely exhausted. And by 1948 they withdrew from Israel, which had over that 2 or 3 decades formed a proto-Israel state, proto-state in Palestine itself, because of organizational skills they came with out of Europe, because of a sense of colonialism, I think, of creating a new Jewish nation under the Zionist impulse. The Arabs were not nearly as well organized, and so you get this war in 1948, immediately after the withdrawal of the British, between the Jewish and the Arab populations. The Arabs, of course, supported by the surrounding nations of the Arab nations. Israel defeats the Arabs in that one and declares the new state of Israel. As I suggested, the British and the French mandates drew a new map of the Middle East and imposed a French style over Lebanon and Syria and a British style over Palestine, Iraq, and Jordan, largely. Some were successful, and mostly, as you noticed, after their liberation in the 1960s. There's a trajectory here of this mandate period that looks a bit like what happens in Africa. You know, so the end. When is the end of the British Empire? A lot of people say 67. A lot of people say when they leave India, 48. But I say it's 67 when they pull out of 48 they pull out of Palestine. But really by 67, it's most of the country have around. Most of the mandates are free, and there's a dictators have been put in place instead. So there's a liberal moment, slightly liberalizing moment under the mandates, but then it moves from British-style constitutionalism or French-style territorial colonialism to brief moments of democratization, parliamentarianism, kind of constitutional monarchies that are quickly taken over by dictators. And I think if you really understand the history from Ottoman Empire all the way into the 60s, you can see the influence of the elites, leftover elites from the Ottoman Empire, who survive in these new nations that emerge out of World War I, and why we get basically these structures that are run by the military, and the economies are controlled by the military, and Islamic parties emerging as political opposition. So that is one of the developments that we see in the 20th century. Naturally, the rise of Israel is the second. By 48, the British are tired of sort of brokering the two communities who cannot agree, that is the Arabs, Palestinians, and the Jewish communities. It's always important to make sure you understand that when I speak of Arabs, I'm speaking of Christians and Muslims, because both populations are in that part of the world, naturally still in places like Lebanon, everywhere else. In 1947, the United Nations, which is one of these new international relations organizations that's part of the post-World War II scene, gets involved with trying to broker and solve the conflict, and is still involved in the conflict today in the refugee camps. In 1948, following the attempt to partition Palestine between the Arab and Jewish communities, the war broke out between the Jews and the Arab countries around it, and Israel won and declares itself the State of Israel with the withdrawal of the British. So you have, in 1948, the Jewish population having come to dominate now the new state of Israel, and already refugees who have fled into the countries around the territory, and that's a problem. Then you get another war in 1967, which again Israel in 6 days defeats the countries around it, massively resisting. The Arab countries around Israel have amassed a great amount of material to attack the fledgling Jewish state, and again they lose. So you have building up in the Arab community, especially, not just in Palestine but in the areas around it, a sense of dissatisfaction, increasing anger at Israel, but essentially dissatisfaction about their own leadership because they've been unable to pull together any kind of sort of solid front against Israel itself. So, as I suggested, a political system that's imposed on them, partly. The international relations community, which is now involves the United Nations, still involves the United Nations, which sits and resolves to do X, Y, and Z in the Middle East, but at the same time is maintaining at this point some 4 to 5 million refugees in Palestinian camps in countries like Lebanon and Jordan. And these refugee camps where you have grandmothers and mothers with keys to their homes, I say homelands and neighbors, keys to their homes in Jerusalem or the West Bank or somewhere else, teaching their children generation after generation that you are going to go home again. This is a volatile situation. So that's some of the key developments. Of course, this is the age of the Cold War. Oil was discovered in the Middle East in World War I. Most people like to write about the Middle East or through the prism of oil politics, how it always involves the Gulf, Iran, Iraq, where the sources, and Saudi Arabia, of course, comes into this about oil politics. So that's a major part of it, and it's all wrapped up in the Cold War past, with the Soviet Union siding with countries like Syria and Egypt, U.S. becoming Israel's best friend and maintaining its foothold basically in the Middle East through Israel. So you have an international relations past, a Cold War past, with hostility over oil, hostility generated by the need for oil, nuclear weapons, and all these are things that our previous lecturers in this course have told you. Steve Streeter, I'm sure, talked about the nuclear America. So, what is the opposition? We know about pan-Arab unity. Egypt, particularly under Gamal Abdel Nasser, who had revved up the war in 67 and then lost it, who had, in fact, suppressed his own people, is replicated in many of the countries across the Arab world insofar as they resisted him. So out of this contest in Palestine over land, you get the development of a sense of Palestinian nationhood. And it is Palestinian terrorism and Palestinian resistance in Al-Fatah originally, and then of course it evolves into Hamas, present-day Hamas, a kind of ongoing resistance to the presence of Israel, which has created the contemporary environment. Religion in the 20th century and in the 21st century has returned as a political force in ways that one who grew up in a nation state as I did, or in a nation state world as I understand it, the world organizes, finds astonishing, stunning actually. Religious, what you might call religious nationalism, or others call terrorism, I think has its roots in a sort of indigenous resistance to the Western world in the Middle East that is exacerbated by the lack of solution to the Arab-Israeli question. I think if you look at developments post-World War I developments, Turkish liberation, the Turks were the only one who came out whole scale with their new country in 1923, defeating the British, who were in occupation Istanbul for 5 years after World War One, and defeating the Greeks and kicking the Greeks out. And that involves, of course, the Armenian question, which is still with us present day. The Iranian liberation is in 1979, when the Ayatollah Khomeini created a new theocratic state, which has a funny constitution that is part secular, part religious, but it is still struggling to define itself since 1979. I think, as we see, there's an occasional uprising. But it is that signaled to the West, who were rather, as pundits, even in my discipline, where you study the Middle East or you study Islam, were very surprised at what happened in Iran. It came as something of a shock. But it was 2001 that I think actually started to focus the world on 9/11, focus the world on the rise of Islam and the influence of Islam across the world as a liberation movement. And in the Middle East, I suggest that people attach themselves to it because it represents the closest thing to their own culture, indigenous culture. You'll find people who are not Muslim attaching themselves to the platforms of the Muslim Brotherhood because they preach social justice, and nobody else is. These countries have lived for half a century under various kinds of dictatorships. Iran, for all its posturing about theocracy, definitely is an operative nation state. Turkey has religious diversity. That is to say, it is a suppressive state, but it's still a parliamentary democracy in the works. Right? Egypt, under the thumb of Mubarak, the Arab Spring. What does the Arab Spring represent? All of those countries are trying to, in effect, liberate themselves from a particular kind of politics to a new kind of politics. This may involve a religious party. I call the party of the Turkish Republic at the moment under Prime Minister Erdogan Muslim Democrats. Europe was built of Christian Democrats. The United States is going through this frenzy, a psychosis of religious idiocy, beliefs at the moment that are affecting the way our whole political system in North America is moving. So, what does role religion play in the Middle East? I think we make a little too much of it in terms of solving questions like the Arab-Israeli question. It becomes too easy to blame Muslim terrorists or Arab terrorists on this question. And I'd like to think that if we give the Arab Spring a little time, we'll see a new formation of the Middle East. But in order to get there, there are two small things that still need to be worked out between Jews and Arabs. One is Jerusalem. Is it going to be a Jewish city? And they're working very hard to make it such. Or is it going to be an international city, shared by all of those who adore or wish to visit its sacred sites? Jerusalem's one. The second is this so-called right of return. There are 5 million displaced people, and lots more in the diaspora, the Palestinian diaspora, who want to go back, we think might want to go back to Israel. And that is a difficult problem for a country that's moving into overcrowded status. So if they're that close to making a decision about one state or two state, and our diversion into questions of nuclear power or to questions of religious fanaticism lead us not to see that the solution is so close. And I would leave it at that.